I'm State Senator Kathleen Wittkopf, and I am the sponsor of this press conference. And being that it's in the Senate parlor, we need a Senate sponsor. So today we're going to learn a little bit about the Forward Institute and their report on school achievement and poverty and in both public and private or public and charter schools. We've all had an opportunity to review the school report cards, and many of us have compared our local schools to those schools around the state. But today, the researchers from the Forward Institute have helped us dig deeper into those numbers and look at that critical relationship between poverty and school achievement. This research adds depth to the DPI report cards that we all saw by analyzing those report cards looking at student poverty. The researchers have also asked another critical question to the policy discussions, especially to those discussions that are going to happen right here in the Senate, almost virtually certain that we're going to have further discussions about charter and voucher schools. So the question that they've asked is, how do public and charter schools compare with regard to school achievement? And as student poverty increases, is the charter or the public school more likely to garner a higher report card? So here at the Capitol, we don't often have an opportunity to talk directly to the researchers about their work and the people that are supporting their work. And I'm delighted to be able to sponsor this press conference, and I thank everybody for taking the time out of their busy schedule to come today. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Scott Wittkopf, who's going to present the results of the research.
Good morning. First, thanks to Senator Wittkopf for hosting this press conference and for a continued focus on educational opportunity for all children throughout the state. Just wanted to quickly introduce the board members of the Forward Institute that are here. Meg Chervil-Heights, Nathaniel Hack, and Julie Wells are our board of directors. And Dr. Kirsty Danielson is here. She performed the statistical and data analysis of the report card scores for this study. And we want to thank the Andrew T. Wallen Memorial Education Foundation for funding this study and believing in starting a truly grassroots think tank, if you will. And there were many people involved in editing and reviewing this report. You know who you are, so I wanted to thank them. The results of this study are simply the product of analyzing all the available report card scores and economically disadvantaged data for all the schools, public and charters, statewide. Just to draw a relationship, just as Nate Silver was able to predict the results of the presidential election, the data that's presented here is clear and certain as much as possible in statistics, but on a much smaller scale. So the data is allowing us to address serious issues in education as long as we can accept what the data tells us. You have a copy of the statement here as well as the full study, and I'm just going to go over some highlights. So what the research is telling us is that poverty is closely linked to school report card scores, and that on the whole, Wisconsin's public schools outperform non-traditional charter schools even when adjusting for the effects of poverty. Currently, more than 4 in 10 school-aged children in Wisconsin are defined as poor or economically disadvantaged, up from about 2 in 10 just a decade ago. A student from a family qualifying for free or reduced price lunch is considered economically disadvantaged for the purposes of the DPI scores, which is approximately 350,000 children in Wisconsin public schools today. Based on the data from the DPI report cards, the study shows a clear link between low report card scores and economically disadvantaged students who already have significant barriers to educational prosperity. Schools with higher numbers of economically disadvantaged students had significantly lower scores on the report cards. The study also shows that nearly half of the report card score variation from school to school can be explained by the variation in poverty levels from school to school. Since higher enrollments of economically disadvantaged students are a significant factor in the scores on the report cards, any current proposals to tie school funding and teacher salaries to report card scores would unfairly punish schools in high poverty districts. As the study clearly shows, A very significant factor affecting report card scores is poverty, something which is outside the control of teachers and schools. The data also revealed that contrary to assumptions that non-traditional charter schools would be more effective through creating competitive choice, Wisconsin's public schools significantly outperformed charter schools overall. This finding was especially evident in those schools with high poverty enrollment. The report card data indicates that public schools continue to better educate Wisconsin children than non-traditional charter schools. Charter schools are also underperforming at the core level of their mission, student excellence and achievement, without the taxpayer accountability of public schools. These findings are important, especially as policymakers look for ways to provide the best educational opportunities for Wisconsin's children while being mindful of the economic burdens on struggling families. Based on the high rate of Wisconsin school children living in poverty and the clear effects of poverty in education, this study recommends policymakers enhance educational opportunities for our children and save taxpayer money by redirecting educational funds to the schools most effective at meeting the current needs of Wisconsin's children, Wisconsin's public schools. There's just a couple of points in the executive summary and recommendations that I want to go over, and then Mary Bell, President of WEAC, will have a few comments. The primary findings of the data are the following. First, that higher DPI report card scores have a significant correlation with lower economically disadvantaged enrollment. Again, almost half the variation from school to school in DPI report card scores can be explained by the variation from school to school in level of economic disadvantaged enrollment. On average, this is based on the mean scores, public schools have outperformed charter schools on DPI report card scores. Even when adjusting for poverty, defined as economic disadvantaged enrollment, in the analysis, public schools perform better on the DPI report cards than charter schools. And the aforementioned finding becomes most prominent in the schools that are serving the poor students. So we have some policy recommendations that we'd like to put forward. The first one is economic disadvantage needs to be acknowledged as a significant factor affecting education outcome. Future economic and education policies need to receive equal and collaborative consideration as the highest priority in the state budget, as both have significant impact on the other. Second, any assessment having direct economic consequences for schools or teachers ought to be conducted independent of the current report card scoring system. Third, a reevaluation of charter school performance, standards, and accountability needs to be conducted and addressed. It's clear from the results of this study that overall charter schools are underperforming at the core level of their mission, student excellence and achievement. Fourth, the data clearly show that public schools are doing a better job of offsetting the effects of poverty on education than their charter school counterparts. A concerted effort should be made to ascertain how and why this is the case, and replicate that effort in all schools and reinforce those standards and methods. Finally, a significant informational campaign should be engaged to inform the public about the results of this report and encourage participation in the future of education and economics in Wisconsin. Teachers deserve to be restored to their place as legitimate authorities on classroom education policies, as well as public policy addressing the local economic impact on students in the classrooms. So that's the conclusion of the study results, and I just had a couple comments from myself based on the study. There's a question that we've lost focus with in regards to educational policy. For the last 10 years, largely a result of No Child Left Behind, we've been focused on teaching to the test, for the outcome of test scores. And now under a report that Tim Sullivan has released under Scott Walker, the focus now is looking to be a job or a vocation or a career. That also is an outcome. What we've lost sight of is why. Those two things, the test scores and a job, are not why we teach kids. That's a result. That's an outcome. We need to get back to the basics of the why in education. And the why in education is the children. And that's what we at the Forward Institute are going to be advocates for is for the why in education. And just to give you an example, if you have children, or you know people have children, when you get them out of bed for school, or your wish for them is not to say, you're going to go to school today to get a job. The reason that you get your kids out of bed to go to school is you want to say, you're going to go to school for opportunity, for prosperity, to be free to do what you want to do as a member of the society. That's what we need to focus on in the education debate. It's not the what being the outcome, but the why, and the why is about the children. So that's the focus of this study and where we're coming from as a public policy research institute. And again, thanks to Senator Weintraub, and Mary Bell will have some comments, and then we'll take questions.
Council. My thanks to Senator Weintraub and the Forward Institute for the chance to add the voice of Wisconsin's teachers here today. What this study clearly shows is that the concentration of poverty in our urban centers, as well as concentration of poverty in schools where there's relatively greater wealth, affects the achievement of students, not because of their potential, but because of the other impacts that poverty has on learning. It identifies that the school report card, as important as it may be to assess and measure what our schools are doing, is not a measure of those schools and of the people who teach in them as much as it is the other societal impacts that those students bring into the schools. Education by schools and by teachers is much more complex than test scoring. The conclusions: public schools educate Wisconsin's children better than the non-traditional alternatives that have been offered. The profession works when we give it the resources to do that work. Redirecting funds from public schools does not meet the needs of our children who come to us with the most challenges. Investing the resources to support those children makes a difference. That's what our state needs to be about. Teachers are and need to remain trusted authorities on the classroom policies that most directly can help their students achieve. It's part of their mission, it's part of why they became educators, and it is the profession in which they are invested and where the data shows they do make a difference. I thank the Institute, again, and Senator Weintraub for this forum today and the work they do. Data is important, but only when you analyze the data and act on what it tells you.
I have two questions. Yeah, one about the, I haven't looked at the report yet, but about how the statistics are analyzed. So, I mean, there are certainly still many more students in public schools than there are in charter schools. How do you sort of compensate for that in comparing the poverty effects, since there's obviously going to be more poor kids total in the public schools than there are in the charter anyway?
Do you want to address the...
Proportionately, actually, charter schools have a higher
Really?
poverty than the public. And you can account for that statistically and equal that between the two groups, and then when you do that, you still see public has a higher score than the charter.
And does it look specifically at the scores of those disadvantaged kids?
It looked at specifically the report card scores for the schools. The overall school, right. This is school report card scores, and then the percentage of economic disadvantage enrollment of each school. For the purposes of the study, it's actually the back page of the study, the bar graph, shows the significant level of difference between scores at the low income levels, which is, for the purposes of this study, the tertiary group of low income was about greater than 50% economic disadvantage enrollment, accounted for about 33% of the schools that had test scores. So in that grouping, you see the significance of the score, whereas in the high and middle income levels, there's really no significant difference in scores when you're talking about high to middle income schools.
And the other question was about the second recommendation in the back of the summary here, where it says any assessment having direct economic consequences for schools or teachers ought to be conducted independent of the current report card scoring system. Is there a more detailed or suggestion about how that should be, how that study should be conducted, how that assessment should be conducted?
We're saying that there are so many factors that figure into not only school performance but student performance. We're just saying that to base, for example, financial reward or financial funding to schools on these report card scores, or in general any test scores, because obviously the report card score was based largely on student achievement scores. That's an unfair assessment of what's happening at the school level, teacher level, and also the larger economic picture and societal picture. So I think that's something that needs to be largely addressed, and it has gotten very politicized, and unfortunately it shouldn't be a political issue.
How about boosting funding based on the report cards, boosting funding to those schools that are struggling, particularly those in poverty?
Well, Superintendent Evers' Fair Funding Plan does address some of those issues of helping schools that are, in districts of poverty or higher economic disadvantage. It addresses that much more so than the current funding formula does. That's obviously something that absolutely needs to happen, because especially rural schools under the current funding formula are suffering badly, and they are not receiving the levels of support that they need, considering the rising cost of education and what's expected of public schools.
I don't know if Senator Beinhout would answer your question. And you said you were certain that these issues were going to be addressed next door here. Can you give us, is it likely just to be in the context of the budget discussion that this is going to be discussed, or what context in terms of the bill or the budget do you think is going to come up?
I was recently spoke with Representative Castell at a superintendent's/business managers state convention, and at that event, I think it was last Friday, he said that we will see the return of the special education voucher bill. We will see a return of a discussion of the expansion of the choice program beyond receiving more. And we will likely see changes in the charter school law. I serve on the education committee. We had a great deal of discussion on some of these bills. Some came forward as part of the budget, as those of you who were here last year will recall. Some came forward as independent bills. So the answer to your question is both.
Sarah Brinkman with Madison Teachers. The educator effectiveness bill coming down from the state looks at evaluating all educators partially on how they perform in a classroom using Charlotte Danielson. But the other half of that evaluation involves looking at data around how students perform. And so I'm concerned about if students' performance is also based on a high level of poverty, how can we then encourage our teachers to work in those areas where there's a high level of poverty? In other words, as a teacher, I was a special educator for 33 years. Certainly my students were often from poverty areas. They were also, by label, lower performing. It will discourage people from going into that field if their evaluation is going to be based on outcome of their students, and they won't feel any kind of incentive to work in those high poverty areas.
That's something that we've talked about a study that we would really like to conduct is getting to that why, first of all, obviously there's a huge societal and economic issue, why the drop-off in scores, but also then why the difference between charters and public schools in those areas of poverty. Instinctively, my guess would say one of the big variables there is teachers. Are you getting teachers that have master's degrees and 20 years of experience in areas of poverty that are really connecting with the kids? Is that something that's an issue? I think that goes to part of the evaluation process, the prioritizing of how do we engage teachers in the classroom and value them in the classroom and bring them back to the table, because they're the ones that are, again, connecting with the students one-on-one. And if the question of why education is students, then beyond the parents, the teachers have the most contact with the students and have the most influence on their educational outcomes beyond all the other variables. So that's something that I agree. I don't have an answer for that. I don't really have any data.
Last week I also spoke with some people who serve on the DPI task force that's working on teacher effectiveness implementation. And the only way, to answer your question specifically, the only way that teachers can be evaluated on student performance, especially in areas of high poverty, but really in every area, is that if they are evaluated on the change that happens within their classroom. It's very difficult to measure that. There has to be a very accurate baseline, and we really haven't gotten to the point where we can say there is, especially in your area, where it's very hard to measure the performance of special education students. But the only way to accurately measure it is to look at the change that happens from the beginning to the end. And to complicate things, in inner city areas, we have a churning or a rotation of students. So the students may be in one school for only 10 weeks. And obviously, if we're going to do an accurate evaluation of that teacher's performance, those students shouldn't be a part of the whole year evaluation. So there are a lot of complicated factors to consider when we're moving forward with this. And definitely, it's going to be a work in progress.
I served on the educator effectiveness design team with the Department of Public Instruction, and one of the key pieces of the student outcome section of that evaluation is to move it beyond test scores, to really talk about setting objectives school by school, classroom by classroom, for the students that you have. Setting setting high standards and outcomes for your students and being accountable to them, but not having it be measured by a test score. It has been one of the things that we have been most concerned about from the very advent of the No Child Left Behind testing program, is that standardized testing doesn't measure so much of what we do in a classroom, so much of what we want for our students and our communities. So we really want to look beyond that to having the classroom professionals working together to set those outcomes and measuring against those things which are going to be impacted by the very students who come to you every day.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you all for coming. Wrap it up. And our website